Goal number 14. Conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas and marine resources. So as the world's population has increased, the number of people consuming products of the sea has increased. And so therefore, whilst there's people to eat the fish, there's going to be people that go out and take the fish. And so we're seeing overfishing happening across the world. In very few areas of the world we have sustainable fishing going on. And so this is mostly a function of the increased number of human beings that are eating those fish, but it's also a function of the fact that more of the population are wealthy enough to be able to access that source of protein and nutrition by eating products of the sea. So this is so what we're seeing across the world in almost all locations, apart from a few quite isolated areas like Norway and sort of remote Arctic seas. The fish stocks are diminishing. We're also seeing changes in the environment which are having very deleterious effects on things like coastal reefs. For instance, as the sea temperature is slowly rising, even a few degrees difference in the sea temperature can cause bleaching of coral reefs, and it doesn't take very long before that bleaching becomes permanent and the coral reef dies. And so we're seeing very widespread degradation and often complete wiping out of fish nursery locations, which then means that the entire ecosystem in those areas of the seas collapses. And so even within the last 20 years there's been vast reductions in the levels of coral reef, so the numbers of coral reefs which have remained viable off the seas of Australia's Great Barrier Reef. The seas also are being polluted very heavily by the sort of disperse and ignore type approach to pollutants and waste. And intensive farming techniques are seeing a lot of water running off the land containing high levels of nutrients in the form of fertilizers. And so this is causing things like algal blooms to happen, which can make water, so the environment, quite toxic for other marine creatures. And so we're doing an awful lot of damage to our oceans at the moment, and we've been doing it for a very long time because the oceans are huge. But the problem then becomes is that we hit a sort of tipping point at which we end up not being able to come back from that, and so we need to do something to conserve the seas, because an awful lot of people rely on the seas. And the ecosystem of the world relies on the seas in order to ensure that they're still available as a resource and as an asset for the world's ecosystem in the future. The same goes for forests, and so with the increased population, it's all very well and good for people in Western countries to say that deforestation, in particularly long-term rainforest or large-scale woodland deforestation in areas that have had woodland for a long time, is a really bad idea. But if you go and visit a rainforest and you've got a population of people there that are not very wealthy, and they can cut that wood down and they can make money by selling that wood, then they're going to find a way of doing that. And it's we may say in the West that it's a bad idea to cut down the rainforest, but when people that are actually living in the rainforest thousands of miles away from the West are just trying to make ends meet and to feed their family and their children, then it's not something that is quite as straightforward as well, we should just stop doing it. Combating desertification, if you haven't heard of the term, desertification tends to come from overgrazing. And so what happens with that is that if you have, and this is a particular problem I've seen in northern Namibia. And so the northern half of Namibia is what we call common land. So it's land that's available for any person to live on and to graze their animals on. And so what happens is they end up with too many people living in the area, too many animals grazing. They take away all of the vegetation, and then the soil surface will either become dusty and blow away because it's not being held together by plant roots, or it will wash away because it's again not being held together by plant roots, and that water will run off the top of it because it becomes dry, it becomes harder, and so the water runs away very quickly. It doesn't soak into the soil, and then because you've got either quite a loose soil surface or you've got quite a dry and hard soil surface, then it's very difficult for seeds from grasses and plants to stop moving and to germinate on that soil. And so we can get this sometimes if you've got a reduction in levels of nutrition in a soil because you haven't been fertilizing the soil and you've been constantly taking crops from it. And so a failure to re-fertilize the soil or fertilize the soil every so often in order to ensure that you can farm it sustainably is as bad as overgrazing the soil. And so what happens then is that land becomes desert, and once it's become desert, it can be very difficult to turn it back into productive land again. Halting and reversing land degradation is not just restricted to the land turning to desert. It can also be caused by unsustainable industrial practices polluting the land and watercourses. So in northern India, for instance, there's a lot of illegal mining going on, which is mining which doesn't have effective planning permission to be there. And there's the water flows through the mines, the surface water from rain, whereas it would normally have flowed over the ground. It flows through the ground and it picks up an awful lot of acidic minerals and heavy metals, and when it comes out into watercourses which rural people are relying upon, and so that turns that watercourse into, I call it acid mine drainage, and it gets a red colour to it, just the surface of the watercourse. So it coats the rocks and the gravel with a sort of red colour from nutrient deposition. There's these dissolved minerals, and it acidifies the water, fills it with heavy metals, and it can become toxic for people. And so we've got land degradation there, where the land is being damaged by unsustainable industrial practices. We're also seeing a lot of biodiversity loss, and this is a problem right at home, where we're not taking care of what are quite delicate food webs, and so we're seeing that we're getting reductions in species like honeybees, dragonflies, butterflies, hedgehogs, all sorts of things like that, where the level of their habitats gradually get nibbled away at a bit at a time, and become more widely spaced apart, and so the animal populations gradually reduce through and this all as a result of development. Promoting just, peaceful and inclusive societies. So you can have very strong levels of development for a long period of time, but it only takes a very short period of civil conflict to bring a country back many decades in their development. If you look at the countries that did very poorly at the Millennium Development Goals, then that was almost all of them have had some form of civil conflict. Promoting just, inclusive societies, again picking up the inequalities in society, but also inclusion of different groups in societies, moving beyond just wealth groups, and also considering population groups as divided by religion or political affiliation, and just societies, to provide a more balanced and fair administration of law and adherence to the law. And then finally, revitalise the global partnership for sustainable development is a kind of general one here, which is that none of the countries are going to be able to do all of this, or for that matter, probably any of these things, if they're just working in isolation. And so we need all parts of the world's communities to work together in order to be able to address this. And the Millennium Development Goals were so successful because the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development did actually involve countries banding together to be able to resolve the problems that they were focusing on. So this is just to pick up the fact that we all need to work together to be able to achieve these goals.